Welcome, everybody. We're just letting folks get in from the waiting room, so we'll wait a minute or two more before we get started. Okay. Thanks so much for joining us for our weekly Carey Institute seminar series. I'm Winslow Hansen, forest ecologist here at the Carey Institute, and I'll be co-hosting today with Dr. Jaslyn Hall. A few technical things before we get into the introductions and the seminar. If you are new to joining us online, please put where you're coming from in the chat. We love to hear of all the places that people are calling in from. If you have technical issues, although we hope you don't, please put those in the chat as well. And save questions for the question and answer feature, which I will moderate at the end of the seminar here in about an hour. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Bob Muscarella. I am co-hosting here with Dr. Jaslyn Hall. Unfortunately, Dr. Hall has bronchitis and has completely lost her voice, but she wrote a very sweet introduction for Dr. Muscarella that I want to read here so I get it right. So Bob Muscarella is an associate professor in the Department of Ecology and Genetics at Uppsala University in Sweden. He's an exceptional forest community ecologist who integrates biophysical, climate, and species niche data into analyses on disturbance and successional dynamics. Now, and remember, this is Jazz writing this. Bob and I were both PhD students with Dr. Maria Uriarte at Columbia University. Although Bob graduated the year before I came to Columbia, he established a set of field plots in Puerto Rico that I helped monitor throughout my PhD. And we spent quite a bit of time in the field together. What I've always admired about Bob is his curiosity and how he allows that curiosity to guide his science into new directions. He has looked at forests from nearly every scale imaginable, from DNA to cellular characteristics, hydraulic traits, all the way up to tree stand and landscape levels. Bob is also uncommonly kind. He has given great thought to what it means to be a good colleague and teacher, and has published articles and led projects on creative teaching techniques and managing large teams of collaborators. With that, it's my pleasure to host Bob for this week's seminar and to introduce his work to the Carey community. So with that, Bob, please take it away. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Winslow, and thanks, Jazz, for that extremely nice introduction. Thanks for having me here, and Matt for organizing a lot of this stuff. It's really nice to be joining. Obviously, it would have been nice to be there in person, but it is such that we take advantage of these online opportunities. So I just get started here. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been involved with in my group and with collaborators to look at environmental heterogeneity and the diversity and dynamics of tropical forests. And just on this note, we were talking with Matt and Jazz and Winslow before the seminar about kind of the silver lining of COVID and these opportunities for online webinars. And it made me want to mention a resource that I've been trying to put together here. That is this database of ecology, or in the broad sense, webinar recordings. So there's a Google form, there's a QR code, there's the webinar that you can see below. I think there's about 123 videos there, and I just encourage you to check this out, use it, and contribute to it if you think you might have some videos to add. It's been a really great resource for teaching, and hopefully the idea is that these webinars don't get lost into the internet ether. Anyways, I just wanted to put a plug for that since we were talking about it. So the next thing is that I want to say also apologize for giving such a broad and kind of misleading title. I know that's kind of what we do sometimes, but of course, if anybody's expecting me to tell you exactly how environmental heterogeneity mediates tropical forest diversity and dynamics, and I won't be offended if you leave. But the real story here is that I'm going to talk about some sources of environmental heterogeneity and how they interact to affect the diversity and dynamics of especially forests in Puerto Rico, which is where I've been working. So of course, I wanted to talk about kind of a broad picture of what's been going on both in my group and with collaborators. And so here are a bunch of people I want to thank right off the bat for what their contributions to the work I'll be talking about. And they have some of them in our group here in Uppsala, and then others from various points along the way. For those of you who don't know, Uppsala is here in sort of the central eastern part of Sweden. It's one of the oldest universities in Europe, and you're all welcome to come and visit sometime. If you don't want to come and give a seminar, it's worth coming anyways to visit our friend Carl Linnaeus, who's buried in the cathedral here. So you can make your pilgrimage to visit Carl. And while you're around, you might have time to go for a walk on one of the so-called Linnaeus trails around town. And these are trails through the woods and through the pastures where Carl Linnaeus was famous for taking his students and pointing out, teaching them about plant diversity and ecology, essentially, back in the day. So it's something that we like to do around here, and following in the footsteps of Carl Linnaeus. But the problem is that it's also gets quite cold and dark up here, and you guys there in New York are kind of aware of that, but we're quite a bit further north. So especially in the winter, it's really nice to escape to the tropics. And this is some pictures from Puerto Rico, where I've been working for about more than the past 10 years to try and understand something about the forests in that area. So as you can imagine, traveling between Sweden and Puerto Rico or other places in the tropics, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in the diversity and composition of forests. And so I think a lot about these kind of broad scale differences between biomes of ecosystems. But of course, when you're in any given place, you can walk up a mountain. Here's El Yunque mountain in Puerto Rico, or other mountains here in Sweden, and you see a huge amount of environmental variation, even at this kind of regional scale. And even if you're standing in a single spot in a forest, you look up and down from the ground layer up into the canopy, and there's a huge amount of environmental heterogeneity happening at that scale as well. And so, I mean, when you kind of put those pieces together, that's really the overarching question that kind of like really piques my interest and curiosity, and in a very broad sense drives the kind of work that we're doing in the group here, is to understand better about how different sources of environmental heterogeneity interact to mediate diversity and dynamics of plant communities. So, I mean, if you think about these different spatial scales, we can think about kind of spatial sources of environmental heterogeneity and how they might interact with one another. And the reason oftentimes it's tied into a lot of very fundamental concepts in the field of ecology, but oftentimes what we really want to use this information to do is to understand the consequences of environmental change for diversity and ecosystem functions. So this is a figure from a recent paper by Morin et al. That I think captures those connections. And what it also does is it reminds us that sometimes we think about spatial sources of environmental heterogeneity, but also obviously we care a lot about what's going on temporally. So temporal aspects of environmental heterogeneity are also obviously extremely important. And this is really the key of what I'm trying to talk about in this presentation today, is really the interactions between different sources of environmental heterogeneity at different scales and what they mean for plant community dynamics and structure. So that's kind of the the general introduction here, but I'd like to just kind of go into the concrete details. So let's go to Puerto Rico, which many of you are quite familiar with, or some of you have, I'm sure, been there and worked there. But here it is, an island in the Caribbean. And besides being a nice place to visit, it's a nice place to do research for a number of reasons. One thing in the context of what I'm talking about here that's great about the island is that there's a really sharp gradients of environmental conditions in a relatively small area. So here you can see some of the very wet forests in the island up here in the northeastern mountains. And if you get in a car and drive for less than 3 hours, you can find yourself down here in the southwest in the Guanica forest. That's a seasonally dry forest. And you can get a sense of how much variation there is in the environment in such a small area. And we're talking annual precipitation ranging from less than 1,000 millimeters per year to around 3.5 meters per year and more. So there's strong climate gradients, also just not even to mention the soil conditions, but there's a lot of variation of soil types and edaphic conditions. Relatively high diversity of species. We're in the tropics, but and we're talking about tree species, around 600 species on the island. So it's very interesting from a diversity perspective, but it's also in a way manageable. We're not talking about the Amazon with thousands and thousands of species, and the taxonomy is well described. There's also a really excellent research infrastructure with lots of existing data. So this is partly due to work that I've done there, but also many other people for a lot longer time have been developing research and data in the area. And that has a lot to do with the Luquillo long-term ecological research site that's there, based in the northeastern mountains, and the University of Puerto Rico, especially having their role to play. So lots of people involved with work in Puerto Rico that is just kind of makes it a really nice place to work and a really kind of rich place in terms of what kinds of data are available to address a wide range of questions. So the kinds of things that I'm interested in and the people that I work with are interested in are really like trying to use different sources of information and pulling together different kinds of information across spatial and temporal scales to understand how vegetation communities respond to environmental variation. And so in the most recently, we've really been looking into anatomical and physiological traits of trees and how those vary across species and across gradients on the island. We have been working with data sets and continue to be adding to these about long-term monitoring of vegetation plots to get at demographic rates and diversity patterns at the stand level. So we have permanent plots set up around the island to monitor these kinds of things. And then more and more also tying into various remote sensing data sets to try to really kind of scale up our understanding of the field observations into the landscape level. So putting all those pieces together is what we're trying to do. And I'm going to tell you about 3 kind of main parts about this question. And what I don't need to read them right now, but we'll start off with some work we've been doing looking at how topographic variation interacts with climate to affect forest structure and composition. So, I mean, we've all seen these images from Alexander von Humboldt. So people have been thinking about the topographic effects on biodiversity for more than a century and even longer, of course, but Alexander von Humboldt, probably one of the most famous examples of how we understand the effects of topography on biodiversity. And of course, we can just know from our own personal experience how topographic heterogeneity kind of affects environmental conditions. both from exposure to the sun and wind and other features, from edaphic properties and erosion, hydrology, and also human land use patterns. So here, this is really the question for this part of the presentation is looking at how topography and climate can interactively affect tropical forest structure, composition, and diversity. So to get at this question in Puerto Rico, we have, as I mentioned, a series of permanent plots located around the island where we do the typical kind of field census where we go out and measure all of the woody stems, in this case, that are greater than 1 centimeter diameter. We ID them and map them and measure them. And so here's an example of a stem map from the Luquillo Forest Dynamics plot, which is a 16-hectare plot here in the Northeastern Mountains. And this is the largest plot in this data set. So we have data like that from around the island. And then for this study, what we were doing is, or the main part here, we can kind of use the spatial information to cluster or to partition the plots into different subplots. And so the analysis that I'll show here is based on subdividing these plots into 10 by 10 meter subplots and looking at the composition and structure in those subplots. And then we have been really fortunate that a team from NASA with their fancy airplane has been down to Puerto Rico a number of times and flown over the island and flown, including these study plots with the G-Light platform, which includes several different instruments to monitor the Earth from the plane, including the airborne LiDAR. So what this provides is very fine scale resolution to put information on topography and canopy height and forest structure. So this is an example of the kinds of data that provides. So here we have maps for one of the plots in the dry forest in Guanica, 4-hectare plot, and then a part of the Luquillo Forest Dynamics plot. And you can see really nice topographic maps derived from that airborne LiDAR, which we can use to reconstruct derived variables like the topographic wetness index, which you can see here, which is essentially trying to use the topographic information to estimate how the hydrology of the landscape, to talk about where water accumulates and where soil moisture would be higher versus lower across a given area. And then, of course, also from the LiDAR, we get information on the canopy height and structure. And so you can see examples of that from the dry and the wet forest also here shown in the image. So putting that information together, this is we were looking at how canopy height varies as a function of this topographic wetness index. So the topographic wetness index, we have kind of the microsite conditions being more dry or more wet from a topographic perspective. And then what I'm going to show you now is each point here is one of the 10 by 10 meter subplots. And then each of the lines is fitted for a different of the main plots around the island based on their location along the precipitation gradient. So what we see here is that in general, topographically wetter microsites tended to have taller forest canopies. So this is not particularly surprising, but the more interesting part of it is that the effect of that topographic effect was stronger in more seasonal and drier forests. So the driest forest in Guanica, which is also the most seasonal, has a very strong effect. So we're looking here, each point here is actually the slope, the estimated slope from the first relationship across the seasonality gradient. So the effect of topography on forest height is strongest in the more seasonal, drier forests, and it's still positive, but much weaker and sometimes not significant in the wettest forests. If we move to thinking about biomass, this is the same type of plot shown here. And we see that biomass is influenced by topography, or biomass varies with this topographic wetness index. But the interesting thing is that the strength and the direction of that effect depends on the precipitation, the climate context. So here again, you see the slope of those relationships at the plot level. And in this case, we see that in the driest forest, the water stress would really limit the amount of biomass that you get, the size of the trees and the biomass that you get in the standing areas of the drier sites, of the topographically drier sites in the dry forest. But in the climatologically wetter forests, actually, the higher you get lower biomass in those in the wetter microsites, and this I think has to do with the amount of water logging in the very wet microsites, whereas you get higher amounts of biomass accumulating in the drier microhabitats on the ridge environments in the very wet forests. So the strength and direction of topography effects on structure, forest height, and biomass depend on the climate context. So of course, this is kind of like a snapshot, and it's also, you want to think about what this means for the dynamics of these forests. And so for that, we need census data spanning multiple years. And so for the analysis that we've been able to do, or that Naomi Schwartz has been able to lead on this, what we looked at was a series of plots that are just in the wet forest, and looking at the topographic effect on growth and survival over a 3-year period that just so happens to have included an extreme drought in Puerto Rico. So here you see cumulative precipitation in Puerto Rico, or in this region of Puerto Rico through different years. So we have kind of like the average year, and then 2 of the years, 2014 and 16, were pretty much average. But 2015 was an extreme drought, and you can see that from the drought monitor on the left here. So the results from that, I'll walk you through this. This was looking at how topography mediated demographic rates during these normal, let's say, more wet years and the drought year. And what we saw is that the drought reduced average growth, okay, but didn't actually affect survival in this study. So that's on average, drought reduced growth. And how did topography mediate those effects? Well, on the 2 panels on the, I should have said, the 2 panels on top are predicted growth across the gradient of slope and curvature. So on the curvature panel, you're looking from more ridge-like environments to more valley-type environments. And then the bottom 2 panels have to show the predicted survival probability. And so what we see is that in normal kind of wet conditions, historically normal conditions, growth was higher in the valleys. Growth rates are higher in the valleys, and survival was lower in steeper slopes. But during the drought year, the wetter microsites had a stronger negative effect from the drought in terms of they had a stronger reduction of growth and declining growth rates, depending if you were located in the valley habitat, whereas there was no kind of interaction between topography and survival over this 3-year period. So that was kind of getting into looking at some of the effects of these interactions between topography and climate in one plot, but this is kind of work that as we accumulate more annual data in plot censuses from around the island, we'll be able to look a little bit more into this kind of question across the climate gradient. And so that's where we go with kind of ongoing work with continued monitoring of the other plots as well. So in kind of to summarize a bit on this part here, I've showed a little bit that local topography has affects tropical forest structure and dynamics, and it mediates the effect or interactions with climate and local topography can mediate the strength and also the direction of these effects, as we saw with the biomass. And of course, this has implications for thinking about estimating biomass and forecasting biomass dynamics and forest dynamics under climate change. Okay, so now I want to tell a little bit about another study that we did looking at climate variability, local environmental conditions, and how those interact to affect seedling survival. And this is again focusing in the Luquillo experimental forests and the Luquillo forest dynamics plot shown here. So this is again the 16-hectare plot in northeastern Puerto Rico, around 3,500 millimeters of rainfall per year. And this is the blue line here is not a river, but a trail system. And along the trail system there's been seed baskets and seedling plots established for a period of, this analysis was based on 9 years of data of seedling survival. And so there's been in that period about 50,000 seedlings recorded. And this analysis focuses on 25 focal species with quite a range of different successional strategies. And there's a lot of dynamics in this forest over that period of time. So we have a lot of death of seedlings happening. And so we were interested to understand how environmental conditions mediate seedling survival. There's also a lot of climatic variation during this period. So this 9-year study period is shown here highlighted in blue, but you can see the longer term climate variation in terms of annual rainfall in the study area. So there is quite a high degree of variation throughout the year, and it's captured quite nicely during the study period. So if we zoom in on that study period here, we see the line for annual rainfall. Another really important environmental factor that changes through time in this area is the amount of solar radiation, which you can see plotted here. And of course, this has something to do with the cloud cover. And so there's some degree of correlation with the annual rainfall. But another interesting factor that mediates solar radiation in this system is dust from the Saharan desert being blown across the Atlantic and altering the radiation conditions there in Puerto Rico. So this is measured oftentimes with this aerosol index that we can see is also related to this solar radiation. So this has never been shown to be an important feature in these ecosystems, or in this ecosystem, for a number of different perspectives, but including solar radiation. Okay, so those are the climatic features that we're looking at. And then in terms of the local sources of environmental heterogeneity, we were looking at a few of the common characters of understory light conditions. We were quantifying that at each of the seedling plots. We have information about the relative soil moisture among the different seedling plots, and also the density of conspecific seedlings in these plots. So these are the local sources of environmental heterogeneity, and put this into a model where we looked at the proportion of species with significant effects that had either a positive effect of survival or negative effect to each of these different sources of environmental heterogeneity. And I mean, one thing to point out is that there is quite a bit of variation across species. So there's a number of species that had positive effects, a number of species that had negative effects for pretty much all of these different variables, except for soil moisture. The only species with significant effects had a positive relationship between survival and soil moisture. But again, to me, the more interesting takeaway from this is actually the interaction between some of these these factors. So, for example, along a gradient of understory light availability, in general, there was some higher survival, but that was really only true in years where there was high solar radiation. So in other words, in years of low radiation, it didn't really matter if you were a seedling in a dark or a bright or open sort of environment, but it was that survival was really increased during the years of high solar radiation, when seedlings were in an open environment and could really take advantage of that resource. And another interesting interaction here has to do with the total annual rainfall and the probability of survival that's mediated by the soil moisture of the site. So actually that positive effect of soil moisture that the majority of species expressed was weaker in wetter years. So the sites with higher soil moisture were more important in the dry years, as you might expect. So these kinds of interactions between climate and local conditions are what I think this study really nicely laid out. And yeah, so to summarize that part then, what we have for is local environmental heterogeneity was both directly affecting seedling survival in a way more strongly than the climatic drivers directly. And it also, these local sources of environmental heterogeneity mediated the impacts of climate variability on the forest regeneration in this system. Yes. So I move on here and talk a little bit about tree growth and wood anatomical responses to a major hurricane. Yeah, so this is some of the more recent work that we've been doing in the group. And so this is the first project that we've been looking at in terms of diving into wood anatomy in these forests. And there's a kind of slide. So, okay, so, sorry. Yes, another source of environmental heterogeneity that's extremely important in this study system in particular are major hurricanes or wind disturbances that come through the island and cause a lot of damage. And the most recent one that you see in that video there, or the most recent major one, I guess, was Hurricane Maria in 2017. And that causes a tremendous amount of damage in the island. So we have before and after pictures here, satellite images showing the amount of defoliation from these, the Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma, which happened just very close time together with Hurricane Maria. You can see that again, this is based on the LiDAR data that the NASA team collected. This movie showing, you get a feel for the amount of structural change that storm created in the forest. So this is a picture shortly after the hurricane. And what I think is important to point out here, and what we were really interested to look at, is to consider these hurricanes both also as an instigator of a resource pulse, really. So you can see here, especially the palms that recover very quickly after the hurricane, and the light environment, which would have before the hurricane been a completely closed canopy forest. And all of a sudden, the light environment completely changes. There's a huge amount of light available for regrowth. There's a flux of nutrients into the soil, presumably reduction of competition both at the below ground level and above ground. And what you end up seeing in response to this is an extremely rapid regrowth of the surviving individual trees in the environment. So this is just from a short time after the hurricanes, but you already see a huge amount of new growth. And this series of pictures taken by a PhD student with me right now, Sam Farrar, had kind of tracked looking at one spot within the Lucio forest dynamics plot over a period of 30 months after Hurricane Maria. And you can get a feel for how quickly the forest is growing after that. So what we see also, not just in Puerto Rico, but this is a analysis. This is a figure from post-hurricane or pre and post-hurricane growth rates of trees in Jamaica after around Hurricane Gilbert in 1988. So what you can see for both trees that were relatively undamaged in the black dots and the more damaged trees that are in the white dots, you can see that growth rates just shot up, especially for the undamaged trees after the hurricane. And they persisted for, at the time of this figure, even 20 years past the time of the hurricane. So these observations, so if we think about, I guess they kind of make you wonder, well, what is the tree doing to capitalize on these resource conditions in the post-hurricane environment? And if we go to think about kind of the tree as a system and how does the tree actually work to capitalize on that, we were quite interested in looking at the architecture of the xylem of the tree to think about ways that the structure of the xylem might mediate those growth responses. So we see, in terms of anatomical traits of the different species in the system, we see a huge amount of variation in anatomy that is related to the hydraulic architecture. And this promoted this question for us about whether trees adjust their wood anatomy to capitalize on the high resource conditions after the hurricane disturbance, or if they are somehow able to achieve these elevated growth rates with maintaining the same anatomical structures. This is a project that was really initiated and done with Kasia Zeminska, who was a postdoc in the group at the time, and lab technician Sylvia Bibo and PhD student Sam Farrar. And what we did was collect wood cores from a bunch of trees in the Lucio dynamics plot, where we have information on their growth rates in the pre-hurricane period and in the post-hurricane period. So in this figure down here, you see each of these little line segments corresponds to an individual tree. And the left side of the segment shows the diameter growth rate during the pre-hurricane period. The right side of the line segment shows the growth rate during the post-hurricane period. And so we focused really on trees that had elevated growth rates in the post-hurricane period, and these were often for a number of reasons, but these were also tended to be trees that, well, first of all, didn't die, and second of all, were relatively undamaged compared to some of the other trees. But there's quite a variation in terms of the growth rates expressed in the pre and the post-hurricane period across species. So we being Sam, who this all happened sort of during COVID. So Sam was in Puerto Rico at the time, and he went around and was able to collect core samples from trees. And we brought those back to the lab and essentially take the core and use the salami slicer to section them into fine sections, stain them, and then mount them on slides, and then image those sections. So you have a high resolution image of the wood that you can see here. And then we go through a process of digitizing those images. So we have a spatially explicit map of the characteristics. And in this case, we're really looking at the vessel characteristics of this sample. we have the cambium of the sample, and then we annotate on here also the rays, and then we have all the vessels annotated as well. And so what we use this for in this case was to use kind of, I don't know, I call it kind of a pseudo dendrochronology approach, where we think about looking back, using tree rings to look back in time. Well, we don't have exactly tree rings in this case, and that's something we're kind of trying to work on. But in this case, we do have information about the cambium at the time of the sampling, and we do have information from our field data, both from dendrometer growth data and our field census data, about the size of the tree at times in the past. And so putting that information together, we could estimate the position of the cambium at the time that Hurricane Maria struck the island. And then we can also go back farther into the sample and estimate the position of the cambium back in 2011 during a previous census of the plot. So we make our best estimate for that. And then what that allows us to do is to estimate the wood that is produced during what we are calling the post-hurricane period and a pre-hurricane period that would have been, based on our best estimates, between the 2011 census and the time when Hurricane Maria hit the island in 2017. And so we use that information then to characterize the different anatomical traits in that post-hurricane wood and pre-hurricane wood. A variety of different anatomical traits that have to do with vessel characteristics, vessel area, density, hydraulic diameter, the theoretical conductivity of the wood, grouping indices, and basic tissue fractions, and actually a variety of other characteristics too. But we were particularly interested in traits that we could kind of link theoretically to the growth rates. So we're trying to understand if growth rates are, if there's a shift in anatomy that can be linked to these elevated growth rates. So the first piece of this analysis was just to sort of understand how much variation and what levels the variation of these anatomical features existed. And so here you're looking at variance partitioning for each bar is a different anatomical trait. And the orange color part of the bar is the amount of variation that's expressed at the among species level. The red parts within species, the dark blue within the individual, and then the light blue kind of that includes both the pre-hurricane and the post-hurricane period, and then the blue, the residual variation. So as you might expect, we have a very wide range of species in here with very different life history strategies. And so the majority of variation in most cases is expressed among species. But there is a substantial amount of variation in these features, both within species and even within individuals. And you can see that even in this example that I show here, that there's you can see easily visually that there's quite a amount of variation as you move through time in this sample of these different characteristics. So here is a similar plot that I showed before with for growth, but now what each line segment is still an individual tree, and the left side is the pre-hurricane value and the right side is the post-hurricane value. But this time we're looking at the theoretical hydraulic conductivity in the wood produced in the post-hurricane period and the pre-hurricane period again. And so I'll show you now the results for all of the different species and individual trees. And you know, there's some that go up and there's some that go down, but on average, we see an increase of theoretical hydraulic conductivity going from the pre-hurricane to the post-hurricane period. And if I just, so the wood produced after the hurricane tended to have a greater potential for hydraulic conductivity than, again, on average, the wood produced before the hurricanes. And if we look at kind of a more species level and community level estimated effects here, we see those effects where if the points for each species are above 0, if they're positive, it means that the post-hurricane value was larger than the pre-hurricane value. So we get a pretty consistent effect across species that on average an increase of theoretical hydraulic conductivity during the post-hurricane period. I could show you the results for other traits, but I decided to leave that out for the time being and just focus on the instead on the theoretical hydraulic conductivity. And so that's what I want to show you. And I think I will kind of summarize this by saying that obviously disturbances affect communities in many different ways by altering the local conditions. And the responses to these disturbances they are rapid, but they can also be prolonged and they can be transient. And so we have these kinds of interactions where extreme events have both direct effects on composition, demography, and diversity of ecosystems, but also effects that are mediated by local sources of heterogeneity. And this is something that to be honest, I wish I had more to present on this at the moment, but this is one of these things that the fact is we're still it was delayed with COVID and it's finally kind of getting up to speed. So I hope that I will be able to be sharing a lot more from this line of work in the near future with you again. But anyways, it's ongoing, and what we're doing a lot of the work that we're doing on this is to expand out to the other parts of the island. So again, looking at the climatic gradient and across species variation, and also within species variation across their ranges on the climatic gradient to understand better about how variation in these anatomical features relates to hydraulic function, and other aspects of species design and function across the species range. So these are just a couple of pictures of looking at two widespread species in the island from a PhD student with me right now, looking at some of the striking variation of anatomical features across these from drier conditions to wetter conditions. So this is kind of some of the stuff that's on the docket right now, and I will stay tuned to hear more about this. So to just kind of wrap up is I'm talking a lot about environmental heterogeneity here, and in particular talking about topographic variation, climatic variation that's caused by extreme events, and we have the research program what I'm trying to do in this seminar and what I'm trying to do in the research program is to pull these pieces together and try and understand how they affect the composition, structure, and diversity. And I think that the real take-home message is in terms of like the puzzle of putting these pieces together is to remember that all of these sources of environmental heterogeneity obviously occur at very many different spatial and temporal scales, and there's a lot of both direct but also interactive effects on diversity, composition, and structure. And so if we really want to understand how ecosystems respond to environmental change, which is really like one of the fundamental aims here, it's really, we need to embrace that complexity and those interactive effects. And I hope what I've been able to show is just some examples of the work we've been doing in Puerto Rico to understand that a little bit better. So again, I thank a lot of the people that that were doing this work, and the funding, of course, and institutions. And thank you for listening. Thank you for having me. And I'd be happy to answer questions and talk some more.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob, for a wonderful presentation. That was super interesting. So folks, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A box. We have one there already, but looking forward to more, and we have times for questions. I'll kick it off. I was curious whether the changes in the anatomy and growth rates that you see after hurricanes influence the susceptibility of those individuals to the next hurricane or other disturbances like drought, which I know has followed hurricanes there.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of the story, and we don't. So, I mean, the short answer is we don't really know, but we can certainly make hypotheses about how that might work. I mean, so the fact, the link between especially vessel diameter and hydraulic conductivity and drought susceptibility is not entirely direct, but there is a link there. There seems to be a link. So I think that what could be happening for sure is that if species, if these trees kind of adjust their anatomical structure to move more water in the post-hurricane periods, if they're exposed to drought or more hydraulic stress, there could be a risk. They could be at higher risk for embolism, and that's something that is really interesting to be looking at. And yeah, so that's the main way. In terms of the main way that we've been thinking about it, and in terms of kind of susceptibility to other storms afterwards, it's another interesting question. And so I don't, I think, how might this affect sort of strength, and between, partly it would be about kind of strength of the wood in response to wind disturbance, but there also might be something to do with the non-structural carbohydrates and storage of resources, how that is mobilized through the anatomical, like through the different tissues, and what it might mean in terms of like if resources are put into rapid resprouting, if what that might mean if there's another sort of hurricane that where you get a lot of damage happening again. If you get compound disturbances like that, you could have synergies happening that cause problems for the trees. Yeah. So no direct answer, but yeah, certainly interesting stuff.
Yeah, so we have a question in the Q&A from Emilio Villanova, who says, "Great presentation, Bob. The last part was particularly eye-opening. Do you think these changes in the anatomical traits could also change with less severe disturbances? I'm wondering how other events with less destructive power can alter these traits. Thanks."
Yeah, thanks, Emilio. So yeah, I mean, we know that trees, if you've been to sort of chronically windy areas, you know that that you can see trees growing off in the direction of the wind. And so, I mean, extreme events or just kind of chronic winds can also affect anatomy and growth of trees. And so that's a good question. That there's a Maria Uriarte has a PhD student actually working on some of that right now in terms of thinking about these chronic winds and how they might affect density of wood and what that means for resilience or response to more extreme events. So again, not something that I have a direct answer for, but it is certainly a good question, and people are working on that in the same system.
Excellent. So a question from Jane Lucas here at Cary. She says, "Wonderful presentation. I'm curious if you have considered whether micronutrients from the hurricane, specifically Ca and Na, have any impact on your plant growth or forest composition."
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, this is a great question, and I mean, I would love to. I think we're going to meet afterwards, hopefully, and I would love to pick your brain on it, because I don't know. I guess it seems like it must play a role. There's certainly an influx of nutrients after the hurricanes, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's, again, part of the story, but we don't have. I don't have good information on exactly what kind of nutrient flux there is after these storms and how persistent it is in the soils either. So yeah, maybe you know more about that than I do, but I would like to talk some more about it. Yeah.
So several of us at Carey are interested in thinking about carbon storage in various forest biomes. And I was wondering if you think about pulling all the pieces together of your presentation and you think about a future with increasing frequency and strength of hurricanes, what do you think that means for the carbon balance of Puerto Rican forests looking forward at like an island-wide scale?
Well, I mean, I think obviously depends on the frequency a fair amount, but I mean, you have like these large storms, they knock down quite a lot of carbon in sort of instantaneous mortality of trees. And then there is a lot of regrowth, but again, like potential, with the compound disturbances, either with more hurricanes happening before kind of you get a successional process where you get the more larger, like late successional big trees coming back in, you could easily have kind of a carbon downgrading of the forests in general, where you get just the long-lived pioneers or like mid-successional species that tend to have less carbon overall. So we can think of it being just kind of like a reduction of the carbon stocks, I would imagine. And then if you couple that with changing hydrological conditions as well, with increasing drought, then potentially could exacerbate those effects. I mean, this is all kind of speculation. I'm just kind of going off, but yeah, I mean, for sure, I think some other work that we've been doing with the hydraulic traits and showing kind of sensitivity to droughts, how that varies also with how that kind of co-varies with response to hurricanes and resistance to hurricane damage. It's another element there. So we get like immediately, we've shown some, or Chris Smith-Martin, who's a postdoc also with Maria, has been doing some really nice work showing that after the hurricanes, you get immediately like resistance to the hurricane damage from the longer lived sort of hard-wooded species. But then over time, there's an increase of species that with a greater degree of hydraulic vulnerability. So yeah, there's a lot of interactions happening between these drivers. So yeah.
Thank you. So I think Evan Gora has his hand up to ask a question, and I'm going to try to allow him to talk. Evan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, really interesting work, Bob. It was great to hear all about it. I was really fascinated by the vessel development work, and I know in talking a bit with Ed Tanner, he's mentioned that the damage status data they had also is really correlated with mortality. So a lot of those damaged trees eventually die over time. And I was wondering if you could comment on how the damage status of the trees you looked at in the plots might be also influencing vessel development, and maybe that contributes to some of the heterogeneity that you saw.
Well, so let's say there were a couple of reasons why we kind of focused on the trees that we did. Of course, like we needed trees that actually produced wood during the post-hurricane period to actually look at what was there, right? So we needed some sort of material. We needed trees that had grown some. And so this tended to be trees, again, that survived, but also that were relatively undamaged. So this is, I don't know if this gets at your question, but if there's some sort of bias in terms of the ones that we're looking at and that expressed an increase of growth rates with the anatomical features, is that kind of what you're going
I guess,
for?
yeah, and not all the trees exhibited the same trend. You had some opposite trends there, and I was wondering if that was basically related to trees being damaged and others not being.
Yeah, well, no, so most of the trees that we got there were in the like low damage category. Now, this is also kind of tricky to do. We have information on the damage, But this is tricky because it's a bit tough to know when you go out after a hurricane and try and assess damage. You're trying to imagine what the tree looked like before the hurricane too, and that's kind of hard to do. So this damage data is all sort of based on a post disturbance assessment. So we don't have like pre and post data on damage. So based on the people who are taking those data, their assessment was that these were almost all in the low damage category.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And that wraps up the time we have. So thank you so much, Bob. It was a wonderful presentation. We all really appreciate it. Several of folks from Cary are going to be joining Bob after this for discussions, and really appreciate it. So take care, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks again for joining and for having me.